Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Devra Davis from Environmental Health Trust, and it gives me great pleasure to be here with my dear friend and colleague, Dr. David Carpenter. We're going to have a conversation today about a far-ranging set of issues of environmental health. And I first have to tell you that I learned of Dr. Carpenter when I was at the National Academies of Science, and we were looking for the best people in the world to work on different committees having to do with toxic chemicals. And his name kept coming up, and we first worked together. I think it's been almost 40 years, and we've been off and on working on various issues relating to environmental health and chemicals, as well as radiation since then. Dr. Carpenter has an illustrious career, which you know from looking at the Patreon advertisement, includes his work as a former dean at the State University of New York at Albany, as well as his continuing work with the World Health Organization, which we'll touch upon briefly later on today, where he's director of a collaborating center on environmental health. Dr. Carpenter, good afternoon. I'm very pleased to have you here.
Thank you, Devra. It's a great pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you. Well, let's start out with talking about, frankly, how you got me involved in electromagnetic fields. Maybe start with what you were doing in New York State.
Well, I came to New York State as the director of the State Health Department laboratories in 1980. And 2 weeks before I got here, there had been a settlement between the State Public Service Commission and the state utility on the question of whether there were health hazards from the magnetic fields associated with electricity, specifically concerned about the people that lived near a high voltage power line. Well, I had previously a little bit experience with electromagnetic fields because I had worked at the Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland, and the Naval Medical Research Institute was very concerned about radar and whether radar had dangers. So when I got to New York, I was a new guy on the block. I didn't have my plate full yet. I was given the responsibility of administering that program, which I did for the next 7 years. And the upshot of that program was that, to my surprise, we confirmed an earlier report that children that lived in homes with high magnetic fields from the electricity outside their home had elevated risks of leukemia. And the elevation was 2 to 4-fold. So that got me involved in electromagnetic fields. I became the spokesperson for New York State after that study was completed. And once you study something as controversial as EMF, I think you never escape. So I've really been involved in it ever since then, although it's not my personal research.
Right, and frankly, when you first asked me if I would review your report, I thought, what is this? There can't be anything really wrong with electricity. I mean, after all, it's what fuels our entire society. But it turned out that your report really opened my eyes, as you have on a number of issues, including PCBs and understanding of the many effects of lead. Let's turn to lead for a moment, as I think it illustrates a number of the problems we've faced in environmental health because of its special effects on the developing brain. Could you briefly discuss your own involvement with that and how the understanding of lead in the environment has changed over time?
Well, I got involved in the study of lead when Bayless Walker, who was the former commissioner of health in a couple of states, asked me, why does lead reduce IQ in children? Well, at the time, I had a large neurophysiology laboratory. And one of the things we were studying was this process called long-term potentiation, which is the first step in the development of learning and memory. And that's pretty well documented. Learning and memory is poorly understood. But I said, well, lead must block learning and memory because it reduces IQ. So I began to study learning and memory, specifically applying it to animals and looking at their brains. And we could demonstrate that it reduces long-term potentiation, which is this first step. Now, lead does many other things, but since that time, I think what I see as one of the major public health problems is we find so many different chemicals that reduce IQ. That's true for PCBs. It's true for methylmercury. It's true for arsenic. It's true for passive tobacco smoke. And all of these that reduce IQ, that haven't all been studied in the way I did, but many of them have, and they do the same thing. But in addition to reducing intelligence, they alter behavior. So that lead causes an increase in ADHD. It causes a reduced attention span. PCBs do exactly the same thing. And if there's anything that is really harmful to society, it's raising children that can never achieve the potential they would have for intelligence because of early life exposure to these chemicals. Now we know that adults aren't safe from these either, but the developing brain is unusually sensitive, and there is a lot of evidence that these effects are irreversible. They can be counterbalanced a little bit by training, but the basic effect is an irreversible reduction of ability to learn and remember, and an alteration of behavior.
Yes, I recall the first time I heard Herb Needleman present some of his studies. He was at Harvard at the time, and he showed that there was a decrement in IQ. And one of the faculty members said, well, just a small drop in IQ, that doesn't matter. And he said, you're a Harvard professor, you would kill for a few more IQ points. And the point is, what we understood from that work, and some of the work that many people have done over the years, Ellen Silbergeld among others, was that early life exposures determined later life behavior and health. And we understood further that the developing brain is one of the fastest growing things in the human body. The other fastest growing thing, of course, is sperm. And they are both extremely vulnerable to this exposure. And in the case of lead, because it competes with calcium, it can be taken up into the brain. And once you have exposure in the brain at a young age, it really doesn't go out. You can chelate the blood, you can remove it from the blood, but you can't really remove it from the brain. And as you say, not only lead, but PCBs and mercury and arsenic and many endocrine disrupting chemicals have all been shown to have this effect on the brain. Now, in fact, cell phone radiation has an effect on the brain. And we know this because of studies that have been done in Turkey, as well as now at Yale University, where they've exposed animals prenatally to cell phone radiation. And they have shown that the offspring that are exposed develop effectively smaller brains, damage to the hippocampus and pyramidal cell formation, which are critical to memory. They're critical to all the processes that we know are so important for learning. And we know this from animal studies, but now we also, unfortunately, are developing human data. Could you talk about when you first became aware that cell phones were at all problematic?
Well, after my administrative work on magnetic fields, I was invited to edit books on effects of EMF. And I wasn't very familiar with the radio frequency literature, but I invited two colleagues to write chapters on the exposure and the health effects from radio frequency radiation. And that was in, the mid-90s. And so there hadn't been a lot of research other than the naval research I mentioned on radar, but there already was some evidence that individuals that had an unintentional excessive exposure developed a whole series of symptoms that did not go away. So that was really my first involvement with cell phone radiation. But then, because I got to be known as the person in New York that had been involved with electromagnetic fields, I got put on a committee of the National Council of Radiation Protection and Measurement, chaired by Ross Adey, who had really done some of the very basic studies on radio frequency radiation and effects on animal brains with extrapolation to those on people. So I think that was probably the time I became much more knowledgeable about the effects of radio frequency radiation and the questions that were posed that at that time were certainly not answered, but the questions remain today, and we have much more information about the hazardous effects.
Now, when did you yourself become concerned about cell phones? And let's talk a little bit about how a cell phone works. Let me take a moment and just for the sake of some of those out here, I'm sure most of our viewers and listeners know what I'm about to say, but I want to make it clear that a cell phone is basically a two-way microwave radio. It sends signals back and forth to the tower up to 900 times a minute. Where are you? Here I am. Where are you? Here I am. And as such, it's using microwave radiation, very weak microwave radiation, but it's not the power of the radiation that is biologically important. It's the pulse and many aspects of the signal involved as well. So we know that basically why cell phones are problematic, contrary to the view of the physicists, is that their irregular signal can damage membranes, can increase reactive oxygen species, which we know can damage cells, and therefore they are problematic. But as to your awareness of this issue of phones itself, when did you, for example, when did you buy a phone? And when did you start to use one, if at all?
Well, I bought a phone very late because my life rotates between my home, which has a landline, and my office, which has a landline. But I also travel a lot. And so I bought a phone to use when I travel. Everyone laughed at me because for years I didn't know my own cell phone number because I never had people calling it unless I was traveling. And you know, on a plane, you wouldn't be using your cell phone anyhow. So I have a cell phone. I've had one for a number of years. I don't hesitate to use it, but I use it on speakerphone or on a wired earpiece. And, you know, the evidence that there is harm from excessive cell phone use is very, very strong. The strongest evidence and the evidence that convinced me most to be cautious in my use of a cell phone, not to avoid them entirely, because I think there are times when the convenience and importance of a cell phone are very good. But the evidence that really is of concern is the evidence that primarily comes from Northern Europe, that long-term heavy use of a cell phone head to your head increases the risk of brain cancer. And only on the side of the head that you dominantly use the cell phone. And, you know, it's only gliomas. There's much less strong evidence for meningiomas. And then the real concern is the glioblastoma. The glioblastoma, that's what Ted Kennedy died of, what John McCain died of, what Johnny Cochran died of, what Biden died of. Now, nobody has stated that these people use cell phones all the time, but you can bet your bottom dollar that in their public life they had to, or they did, probably because nobody had warned them that a wired earpiece would be safer. So that evidence I find just to be overwhelming. And there are other health effects that we know about. They may be less 100% documented, but that evidence that cell phones increase the risk of brain cancer is just overwhelming. Now we have the results of the NTP report, the National Toxicology Report, the Ramazzini Institute in Italy, documenting that cell phone radiation at intensities you get from your cell phone, but even at intensities you would get from a cell phone tower and living near it, increase the risk of these same two kinds of cancer in animal brains.
Very important for people to understand that while they have strongest evidence in humans on brain cancer, there's also new evidence on thyroid cancer. There's even some evidence on leukemia. And when the problem is this, why are we insisting on proof of human harm? That's the fundamental problem. What we need to do is a better job of paying attention to animal research. You and I know very well from your work with the laboratories and mine at the University of Pittsburgh Cancer Institute that laboratory studies can show us which things are most likely to become carcinogens in humans. And the whole reason we do animal research is to predict effects on humans so we can prevent those effects from happening. And the problem is right now, we've got it to be fine back asswards. We are asking, can we prove people are sick? I think we have clear evidence that people are sick. But in addition to that, we should have acted much sooner because the animal evidence was so compelling. And I think, talk for a moment about the difference between the animal and human evidence as from a scientific point of view and a legal point of view.
Well, it's usual. We're accustomed to talking about cancer in animals. And for years, we have been able to control exposure to animals. You can give them increasing doses. You can have the animal exposed to only one thing. And so some of the original skepticism about the electromagnetic field effects on animals was that nobody had really demonstrated convincingly cancer in animals. In the New York State Power Lines project that I administered back in the 80s, about the only significant negative effect that we found was that we didn't develop cancer in animals. But we still had all of this evidence that there were biological effects, and they were short-term effects. The latency for cancer is long, and it was very expensive in these most recent studies. The National Toxicology Program was one of the most expensive toxicology studies ever done by the National Institutes of Health. So we had evidence, strong evidence for human disease long before we had evidence for animal cancer. And that really is why when the International Agency for Research on Cancer reviewed the effects of radiofrequency fields, they rated them as only possible human carcinogens because there was at that time lack of strong evidence for animal cancer. That has changed so dramatically. Now, what we really care about is human health, not animals. And we have that evidence. We've had that evidence for human adverse health effects, specifically cancer, really for decades now. And why people insist on ignoring it is frankly just beyond me. The evidence is so strong. Anybody that reads the literature is going to come to the conclusion that excessive exposure to radio frequency fields cause cancer.
Well, I agree with you that there's no question in my mind, or that of many of the colleagues with whom I've written, that the evidence at this point, combining animal and human evidence, is compelling. There's clear and strong evidence that cell phone radiation and other forms of wireless radiation can cause cancer, but also can cause a whole range of other problems, including damage to sperm, damage to the mitochondria, which is the engine of cells, damage to membranes, which are critical to every cell in the body. So one of the questions we were asked was, imagine that scientists would have had unlimited resources to study this problem and a political will and spirit to do so. What would our current understanding be of these biological processes? And frankly, why has ICNIRP taken the view, that's the International Council on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, taken the view that there is no evidence of any effect except heating?
Well, this has been a problem because of the statement of faith, and it's only that, by the physicists and engineers, that any form of radiation that does not directly damage DNA cannot have a biological effect. Now that comes directly from what we know about ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation is like it is an electromagnetic field, but is at much higher frequency and contains more energy. And yes, ionizing radiation can directly damage DNA, cause cancer, cause mutations. Ionizing radiation also indirectly damages DNA by, with the cosmic ray comes through your body, it's more likely to hit a water molecule than it is to hit a DNA molecule. If it hits a water molecule, it breaks that water molecule apart and forms what we call reactive oxygen species, or free radicals. Well, microwave radiation also forms free radicals and also damages DNA. One of the very important findings of the National Toxicology Program was DNA damage in the hippocampus of rats that were exposed for 2 years to intensities of radiofrequency radiation like that you would get from a cell phone. So this is just, it's a fake difference between the ionizing and the non-ionizing radiation. Certainly the lower intensity, the lower frequency does not directly damage DNA, but indirectly it does damage DNA.
And this has been a very difficult concept for some of our colleagues to understand, that you can have indirect damage of DNA. And yet we know, as an example, asbestos causes cancer. As far as we know, it does not damage DNA, but there's no question it causes cancer. The same thing is true for arsenic. There's no doubt that arsenic can cause cancer, and yet there is little evidence that it damages DNA. So even if there was no evidence of DNA damage for cell phone radiation, it still could be a cause of cancer. And as you have just pointed out, the National Toxicology Program, in the gold standard study that took years of planning and spent more money than any study has ever spent, not only found DNA damage in the hippocampus of the male rat, but found DNA damage in mice as well, and in multiple organs, including the heart, including the liver. And those are organs that are very important, obviously the heart for survival, but we know that the type of tumor that was found within the heart of the animals is comparable to the kinds of tumors that we see in humans, namely the schwannoma or the neuroma, which is a thickening of Schwann cells around a very vital nerve. And those kinds of damage, we've seen this evidence, and yet I come back to this question: why do you think ICNIRP has so far refused to look at this evidence? Why, for example, did the FDA, which requested the National Toxicology Program in 1999, why did the FDA reject the findings of the National Toxicology Program?
You know what, on this issue of magnetic fields and childhood leukemia, there were a number of studies up to about 2000. At that time, there were 4 meta-analyses, all of which confirmed that exposure to magnetic fields, elevated exposure, called childhood leukemia. I looked at 20 additional studies from 2000 on and found that all of those supported by government agencies and foundations, there were some 7 studies that found statistically significant elevations of childhood leukemia, all supported by government agencies. There were a number 7 that had an elevated risk that didn't quite reach statistical significance, all supported by government. And there were 8 that reported no significant effects, all supported by industry. One has to look for conflicts of interest. ICNIRP is an independent organization, self-appointed members with a long history of ties to the telecommunications industry. The FCC, which is the organization in our country that's responsible for setting standards, the past chair, most of the members come from the telecommunications industry. How can you expect the fox guarding the chicken house to set standards that are protective of public health? Now, I and a colleague and 6 colleagues from Europe went to the World Health Organization in Geneva to try to persuade the people there, people that I work with in my collaborating center, to change their policy with regard to electromagnetic fields. And they said, well, ICNIRP is an official NGO of the World Health Organization, so we have to take our advice from them. Well, my response to that is nonsense. You're taking advice from a group of people that deny the science, but we have yet to change the responses of the World Health Organization with regard to health effects of electromagnetic fields.
When did this meeting with the WHO take place? And are you talking about a meeting with headquarters with the former director or with the current director?
This was a meeting with Maria Nera, who's the director of the Office of Public Health in disease prevention, and Emily Van de Veter, who is the head of the specific office that deals with both ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. And we basically got nowhere. Now we did, with my European colleagues, we wrote up a response that was published in the journal Environmental Pollution on thermal and non-thermal health effects of electromagnetic fields, which I think is probably the best, more recent summary subsequent to the bioinitiative report that pulls together all of the evidence for cancer, for effects on learning and memory and cognitive function, for this syndrome of electrohypersensitivity, and also a discussion of the mechanisms that are involved, which involve primarily reactive oxygen species and free radical formation.
Well, I really hope that you and I will be able to work more together and try to come up with a strategy that will get the WHO to change its view, because we both know that there's a substantial body of evidence on this issue and that it's only growing. And on the other hand, politicians understandably think that they should rely on a group that sounds like the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection. And I actually respect some of my colleagues who belong to that group, but I think that they have some bizarre standards for causation when it comes to the kinds of evidence that we have. And they're insisting that we have proof of human harm before taking steps to prevent that harm. And I think that the mounting evidence on electrohypersensitivity is one of the most compelling and one of the most tragic and sad things that we have. There are people who cannot live in modern society. There are people who used to work in New York City in very sophisticated jobs in programming and graphics design, who have to seek shelter and keep moving from one place to another because they cannot tolerate wireless radiation that most people can tolerate. And I actually think that everyone responds to electromagnetic fields, but some people know it. And that makes it a much more difficult thing. When we talk about these electromagnetic fields, though, even for the kinds of electromagnetic fields that come out of a light switch, why do we not have any national standards? Have you been involved in efforts in the past to create standards for these? Just to clarify, I'm talking about 60 hertz, which is 60 cycles a second. That's what powers the lights in our ceiling and our wired computers that you and I are both using right now. But in addition, as you go up the spectrum, you go up to 2.4 billion cycles a second, which is current generation of so-called smart and cell phones. And then for 5G, of course, you're going to be going above that up to 100 billion cycles a second. So what happened here, and what can we do now?
Well, I think the big challenge for people like me in public health is getting people to understand that while everybody likes their devices and everybody thinks that it's cool to have the latest model, we are doing harm to our bodies. And the problem is that we've been so poor at communicating how strong this evidence is to the general public, because the regulators are not going to pay attention when they all come from the industry until there's pressure from the public to protect their own health. And I think we have not been very successful at that kind of communication. The thing is, there's so many simple things one can do to reduce your exposure. And you don't have to give up on using your cell phone, but by using it responsibly, you can dramatically reduce your risk of disease.
Of course, I completely agree with you. And I think that it will be very, very important. We have now revised our website, ehtrust.org, and it includes excellent advice, much of it prepared by Theodora Scarato and some of our colleagues, about how you can wire your life, how you can create a safer technology platform for your children, many of whom are being bombarded with requirements now to be in front of screens for hours a day. And I think we welcome feedback from the public about what else we need to do, but this is practical advice, step by step, about what you can do now, as you've just said, David, to reduce your exposures. Some of this is pretty simple. Some of it is not quite so simple, but please do look at our website and let us know, by the way, all you Patreon members out there, we really want feedback about what's wrong or what's good about the new website, because we want to provide better information so that your criticism, David, will not be as valid in the future. But I do agree that we haven't done as good a job communicating. But you know, the fact that this is complicated, and it is complicated, has made it easy for the industry to proceed, because most politicians have not a clue about how any of this stuff works. And they just assume that there's a National Council on Radiation Protection and they've told us what to do. Whatever happened to the draft reports? Why did EPA get defunded? You were involved in those discussions. Why do you think they got defunded?
Well, I think it was because there was pressure from the industry that didn't want their product viewed as being harmful. And that happens right up till the moment. But let me expand on one other thing you just said. The reality is that the exposure of the general population to radiofrequency radiation has just increased enormously in this decade. I have someone sent me a plot that showed about 2005, there was an exponential rise in the ambient exposure to radiofrequency radiation in most urban areas. It was more cell phone towers, everybody on a cell phone. You can't walk down the street, at least you couldn't before the pandemic. You couldn't walk around the street without bumping into people that were so focused on their phone, they weren't watching where they were going. You know, if there are, not if, but the diseases we know to result from exposure, when exposure is increasing so dramatically in almost everybody in the developed world, and even in the developing countries, we're going to see increases in these diseases. And, you know, it's very difficult to put the genie back in a bottle and get people weaned from using technology unwisely.
You know, that's a very good point, and I feel that that's part of why we must continue these efforts that we're making right now here and today, and that hopefully you and I can continue with further conversations, because we've got to do a better job of explaining, if you will, wireless radiation for dummies. You know, we need to be able to make it clear to people, this is not innocuous, this can be harmful. And the best thing to do is to avoid exposure altogether. Where you can't avoid exposures, here are some of the things that you can do. And I think, interestingly, there's been a growing recognition in the clinical community that there are biological impacts of this kind of radiation. I know that I've had conversations with cardiologists who report a growing number of young men who are athletic with atrial fibrillation. And many of them are wearing all these gizmos around their chest to monitor their heart rate, and then they have something on their wrist, and they're all wired back and forth all the time, and they've never had any history of any problem, and suddenly they get atrial fib. Well, there's a whole use now in medicine of wireless cardiac monitoring. Would you comment on that for a moment, please?
Well, that's correct. And there's a building body of evidence that people that are excessively exposed will have cardiac arrhythmias. Let me give you another example of something that, you know, there's long been evidence that sperm counts in developed countries have been going down a lot. Well, one of the things I like to say, because when you talk about anything related to sex, you get people's attention sometimes more than you talk about cancer. They think cancer is something for old age. But, you know, there's such strong evidence that radiofrequency fields at non-thermal intensities reduce sperm count. I've said several times, just to make the point, that a man that uses a wireless laptop on his lap for about 6 hours probably doesn't need to wear a condom for the next week. You know, I mean, that's obviously not something scientifically documented, but it is really true that this exposure reduces sperm counts. And the level of infertility in developing countries is getting greater and greater every year. Now, there are other reasons. People are waiting to be older before they reproduce. But if there are simple things you can do to maintain your sperm count, like don't have a wireless laptop on your lap very long, then it should be done. There's evidence that women that wear their cell phones in their bra have increased breast cancer. I found my own daughter doing that. I hollered at her and gave her reprints showing her not to do that. She's a practicing veterinarian. And she said, I need my hands and I also need to have my phone nearby. What do you do? Simple, people need to understand that there's simple things you can do that will allow you to use technology, but use it safely.
Of course, I completely agree with you. And one of the dilemmas that we face is that, of course, young people think they're invincible. And with respect to the breast cancer story that you just alluded to, we at one point had 39 cases. We were not able to get histopathological confirmation on each of them, but 39 people gave us information that they believed that their breast cancer was due to cell phone storage in the bra. 4 of them were age 21, no family history, no genetic vulnerability at all, but they had kept the phone right over their breast, and the breast tumors developed right under the antenna of the phone. I remember when I got the phone call from a colleague of mine in California and said, "You're not going to believe this. I've never seen anything like this in my life." And he was really dismayed and convinced, because this was a young woman who was a runner, who was Asian American. So we know that Asians have very low rates of breast and prostate cancer. And so the fact that she developed these tumors right under where she kept the phone stored was really very convincing as far as he was concerned. And John West then went on to publish a report on a few of these, but unfortunately there were many, many others. And in addition to the cancer story, the sperm count story has been around for 12 years that I know of. In 2008, Ashok Agarwal published a report from the Cleveland Clinic where they took sperm from men who came to the infertility clinic, which he directs, and they put them in test tubes. And one test tube was a control, and the other got exposed to cell phone radiation. And within a few hours, the cell phone radiation exposed sperm had 3 times more damage to their engines, to their mitochondria, and had dropped in count 3-fold. So they died 3 times faster.
Right.
Of course, sperm aren't going to live in a test tube. And as you know, we need a lot of sperm to make a healthy baby. Now, I'll share a joke with you. Do you know why we need about 250 million or more sperm to make a healthy baby?
Well, the pathway from deposit of sperm to the egg is a very long one. Fertilization takes place in the tubes, not in the uterus, and so it's a long pathway, and only the healthiest sperm have the energy to get there.
And as a matter of fact, if sperm was a human, the sperm has to swim the equivalent of from Los Angeles to Hawaii. And that's just to give you some idea of exactly what you're talking about. But the reason we need so many of them is that sperm don't know how to ask for directions.
Right.
So, but the reality is this is a very serious issue, and it's not just sperm damage that we're talking about. There's also, of course, the many, many studies on animals showing that prenatally exposed animals produce offspring that themselves produce more damaged sperm, as well as damage to their ovaries, as well as damage to their brain. And in fact, my colleague in Turkey, Nesrin Sahan, has shown, as well as Suleiman Kaplan, they've published studies which you can find on our website at ehtrust.org, showing prenatal exposure produces animals with fewer cells of the hippocampus, for example, and more damage to the testes from prenatal exposure. Now we have in the United States, Professor Hugh Taylor at Yale, who showed that prenatally exposed animals also produce more hyperactivity. Now, unfortunately, from some of the studies done by Di-Kun Lee, where he's looked at magnetic fields, so that's not the same as cell phone radiation, but he looked at prenatal exposure, and magnetic fields are also, as you know, associated with cell phones. He showed that women with greater exposures during pregnancy produce offspring with more hyperactivity, as well as more obesity, a series of problems in these offspring, all from exposures that take place prenatally. So it's a very, to me, I feel quite sad to see that there is this failure to acknowledge the importance of this. And may I add that they no longer call laptops laptops. They're called tablets. They belong on tables. And by the way, Dr. Carpenter, there are studies showing that if you take human sperm and put it in petri dish that has no heat coming from a computer, cover it with a laptop, you get an increase in damage into the sperm from laptop radiation. I'd like to turn to something that is not an easy thing for us to talk about, but I think I want to give you an opportunity to do so. The New York Times wrote a piece last year, which was, in my opinion, a hatchet job. It was not well informed, but among other things, it appealing to the young, hip NPR generation, as one of our Patreon members has indicated, kind of painted you out to be some kind of way out there in the fringe view. Now, what is your reaction to that piece? And I'm going to tell you mine when you finish that.
Well, I was almost amused by this because I was painted as being a pawn of the Russian government because I did an interview with Russian television. Now, actually, if you read that piece very carefully, he was quite complimentary of some of my background. But this idea that because I did an interview with Russian television, I was a pawn of the Russian government. Well, in the first place, it was the Chinese government, not the Russian government, that the Trump administration was so concerned about. And that piece suggested that I was trying to prevent the development of 5G technology in the US to the benefit of the Russians. Well, as it happened, I'd just come back from China, and he apparently didn't know that, or I would have been a pawn of the Chinese government. But in any case, to be serious about this, that person was just totally uninformed. And he was writing a piece to sell, to get picked up by other. I can't fathom why he would have written a piece quite like that. It demonstrated a total lack of looking at the level of scientific knowledge that we have. And it was obviously an attempt to discredit me. Now, there is a problem that we have a lot of advocates that are not scientists that go off on pretty wild streaks. And I think they do harm to those of us that think that the science is very strong, and we should not go past the level of evidence that there is for both human and animal exposure and disease outcomes. I let that roll off. I have a thick skin. You know, if somebody wants to berate me, fine. It won't be the first time, and it probably won't be the last time. But my response is to try to stick with the science. And I am a public health physician. That means my job is to alert people when there is the possibility of harm from something that they can have some control over. And if people don't want to believe me, that's their prerogative. But it's not going to stop me from telling people what I think is they could do to reduce their exposure to harmful things.
I'm not alone in saying that I'm proud of you. And as you know, I called you when that came out and I said, what are you going to do? And you said, nothing. And I was shocked. You said, no, it's not worth my time. But I then went and wrote a piece about what was wrong with the New York Times article. And in fact, Professor Tom Butler in Ireland submitted to what they have in Ireland, which is an ombudsman for the press. For the country of Ireland, they have an ombudsman, and that job of that person is to review statements in the media to see whether they're fake or real. And we know this is unfortunately a growing problem throughout the media throughout the world. Well, the Irish government appointed an independent investigator to review William Broad's article after this formal complaint to the Office of the Press Ombudsman was made. And again, on our website at ehtrust.org, you can find the response. Basically, the ombudsman for the country of Ireland ruled that the New York Times article was inaccurate. And I think that's a very important fact that is unfortunately little known. Perhaps our Patreon listeners can help us get that information out more broadly. Again, it's on our website, but more importantly, it was an outrageous attack on you. And I was so deeply offended that somebody who's devoted his life to public health would be described in such a way. And I myself have been subject to these sorts of things, but never quite at that level. And frankly, I had a great deal of respect for Bill Broad. I think he's an excellent writer. He's an award-winning writer. He has the ability to write about things in a way that make you really sing. It's just absolutely beautiful writing. But in this case, he got it dead wrong. And the consequences are enormous. The New York Times repeatedly refused to make factual corrections to things that were in that article that were wrong. And you can find all of those on our website. Theodora Scarato, our executive director, repeatedly wrote to the New York Times asking them to make this correction. I wrote to the ombudsman for the New York Times. Lloyd Morgan also did as well. And it was a very, very disappointing development. But I want to go back to something you just said about sometimes the activists get ahead. We can't wait for science all the time. And we do know that 5G is now being rolled out everywhere. And I believe you have signed an objection to this. We say, stop, you need research, which you don't have. And I'm going to tell you, we do have research and we have evidence that 5G has biological effects. Let me mention two things. First, 5G-like frequencies are currently used in medical devices that you can buy on Alibaba and on Amazon. You put in a high frequency medical device. They're often used to treat pain, right? Sometimes at very weak powers. They're also used in something called the beamer, which is a low frequency device. But there's a wide range of medical devices that currently use the same frequency that we're being told has no effect. So there's something wrong. Either it has an effect or all of these devices are just placebo. So we know that 5G is highly problematic and should be stopped. No question about it. Now, let's talk about the burning of towers. Let's talk about what we know about chemicals. Let's talk about what we know about exposures that happen when you burn things that you know very well because you had fires in New York that you had to go in and evaluate the impact of what happens when you burn the things that are in electric transformers. And even though 5G is going to be using lower frequencies in the beginning, any 5G antenna that works will have to have within it 3G and 4G because that's what most of our devices currently are powered by. And phones for the foreseeable future are going to be using 4G anyhow. But those towers will, if they work for 5G, have to have 3G and 4G, which we already know, as you've said, damage sperm, cause cancer, cause memory loss, and insomnia, and a host of other problems.
First, emphasize what you just said, that the rollout of 5G, the little mini cell towers are being put out on the streets in Albany right now. Those are not going to only generate 5G, they're going to generate 3 and 4G as well. And that's where the danger comes from that we know about. We should not be rolling out 5G until it's studied. It hasn't been studied. But I am vehemently opposed to violence of any sort. And this business of people in the UK burning down cell towers as a means of protesting the rollout of 5G, it's illegal. It's immoral. There are ways to make legitimate protests. It should be done at the level of government. It should be done at the level of informing your neighbors of hazards. But taking life into your own hands and destroying property is just totally unacceptable.
And if you go to our website, I've written an op-ed that says exactly that. Please don't burn towers, because if you do, you're going to create dioxins in the local neighborhood. You're going to create heavy metals. You're going to be creating damage in the local neighborhood. And you may not even stop the antenna. Now, in fact, we don't know if all these fires were caused by protesters. We know in 1 or 2 cases they were, or whether they might have been spontaneous. That has to be investigated. There were fires in Denmark. There were fires in the UK, and those need to be investigated before we assume that these were all, protest fires. But obviously, I would agree with you. It's wrong. It's immoral. But I actually think this industry has behaved immorally. I really do.
I agree with you on that.
I think, right. If we look at the data and we look at the fact other countries have more stringent standards than we do because they have taken an independent look. Let's talk briefly about what France has done with testing phones. As you know, France tested phones that randomly were purchased off the shelf. Now, in the United States, we don't do that. We take the phone that the industry gives us, whichever one they choose, and we put it through tests. And we take the data provided by that test and we accept it. Now, in the case of the Apple iPhone 10, 11, and I'm not sure about 12, but I'm going to tell you why I think it's even going to be worse. Those phones already emit, at the US test standards, more radiation than should be legally allowed. Let me explain why. Because the amount emitted by those phones, is in fact within 30% of the maximum limit, which is 1.6 watts per kilogram. So the iPhone 10 is 1.55 watts per kilogram. I mean, that's just crazy, right? It's close to the limit. And we know if they go ahead with phones, that are without any headsets and only for the wireless earbuds, which are sending Bluetooth signals through the brain, which is a terrible idea for obvious reasons, then they're going to have even more radiation. So these phones, which are in truth mini computers, they can do a lot of things, belong nowhere near the body. And they have got to be evaluated more carefully. But what the French did is they evaluated their phones in the real world. And when they evaluated their phones in the real world, what they found was that real world phones, when tested in the pocket next to the body, emit up to 7 to 11 times more radiation than in the United States. And that's an article in the peer-reviewed literature showing that was written by Om Gandhi, taking the French data. Now, we test our phones in a holster. A holster. Nobody uses a holster anymore. We have little children running around with these things right on their bodies. The iPad is tested 8 inches away from a large adult male body. We are flying blind, as Senator Blumenthal said, when it comes to safety information that we have here. And so what I would tell you is other countries have much more stringent standards. The French have an entire agency which is devoted to evaluating radiation of devices. We have in the FCC an office whose sole job is to see whether one device will not interfere with another. And that same office is now looking at cell phone radiation. Let's make sure radiation doesn't interfere with the operation of these devices, not at all the question of their biological effects.
No, it's just ludicrous.
Right.
It's irresponsible. Our government is not protecting us.
The question we have been asked, David, is what are some of the best studies to give to skeptical professionals that you think provide a compelling case? And again, I would urge you people to look at our website because we have new information on that. But in your opinion, I would say the Bioinitiative report that you and Cindy Sage put together is an excellent compilation by some top people from around the world of what has gone on in this science. But of all the studies, and I'm sure there are thousands, what do you view as the most effective?
Well, the bioinitiative report is encyclopedic. It's so big that no one's going to read the whole thing. So if you want the nitty-gritty details of everything that's been done, that's the place to go. Most people aren't going to take the time to do that. I think, in my judgment, some of the studies of brain cancer coming from the Hardell group in Sweden are the most convincing. It's very interesting that the Interphone study, which was a study in many countries, has wonderfully convincing data, but because of conflicts of interest in the members of that panel, that was hidden away in a supplemental thing that's online. And the abstract to the article says that people that use a cell phone don't have any more cancers than people don't use a cell phone. It's again an example of the conflict of interest. I would really reference our paper with my European colleagues called Thermal and Non-Thermal Effects of Electromagnetic Fields, published in Environmental Pollution, a year and a half ago. It's a very good summary of data. There are so many good papers. The study by Volkow, who's the director of one of the NIH institutes, demonstrating that an active cell phone held to the head, even though it's muted, increases the metabolism of the brain underneath that part of the head. That's a wonderful study. There have been a number of good studies on this whole syndrome of electrohypersensitivity. There have been a number of studies that have demonstrated that some people that say they're electrosensitive cannot distinguish whether the fields are on or not, but there are other good studies that show that they can. It's how you design the experiment. And I think looking at some of the reviews are probably the best way for people to get a sense of what the weight of the evidence is. But whenever you look at a paper, look at who funded it, because you can bet bottom dollar if it's funded by the telecommunications industry or the power line industry, there's going to be a perversion of the reporting of the results.
You know, you're being very modest. You didn't mention your own article in The Lancet with Pri Bandara. I thought that was a superb contribution, and that was just a year or so ago. And frankly, I'll be immodest and tell you about Anthony Miller, who's a very dear colleague of mine, who wrote an article recently with me and Iris Udison of Rutgers and others, where we concluded that based on all the evidence now, if the World Health Organization were to have a truly independent panel look at the evidence now, and that may be impossible given what's going on with our government and WHO right now. But if a truly independent panel were to be convened by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, and if that panel were to use the criteria that has been established by that agency for more than 40 years of use, developed by our dear colleague David Rawl, as you know very well, that they would conclude, if you looked at all the experimental evidence and all the human evidence, as you said earlier in this podcast, they would conclude that we have clear evidence that this is a human carcinogen. And I think that obviously as an author of that paper, I think that's an important contribution as well. In addition to that one, let me just add that the one you mentioned about Volkow showed this increase in glucose metabolism in exactly that part of the brain with the most exposure. And the people had no idea whether they had two phones strapped to their head, and they had no idea whether the phone was on or not, because there was nothing coming out of it, no sound whatsoever. What we know about glucose is it accelerates the growth of cancer. There's no question about that. So we can show acceleration of glucose in the brain just from a cell phone strapped to the head. I think we'll end on that note. I want to say it's been a delight to talk to you. And I look forward to further conversations, because I hope people will understand there are things you can do. You can make a difference. You can share the information that Dr. Carpenter and I have talked with you about today. And please do look at our website for more guidance on what you can do now to protect yourselves and your family. Thank you so much. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Devra.
Pleasure.